Hey everyone, David C. Anderson here coming at you from the Knife Center, and today we're pitting two knives against each other. It's the Buck 110 Slim Pro against the Spyderco Stretch. On one hand, you have the most iconic folding hunter ever made, updated for the modern era, and on the other, you have a hunting-friendly design from one of the most prolific and successful modern knife companies out there. Let's do this. The Buck 110 is an absolute classic. It's earned its place on people's hips since the 1960s, and its recent updates put it square in line with other modern hunters' folding knives, thanks to modern materials and hardware and particle steel blades. The Stretch is Spyderco's take on a hunting knife, and they've applied their unmistakable design language that makes them an industry leader to this style of knife. Let's start by comparing the blades themselves. Now, the Buck features a traditional clip point blade that's actually a little bit different from the original 110s, and it features a straight clip point rather than a more heavily scooped out clip, which makes it a little bit more EDC friendly. The length is nearly 3 3/4 of an inch long, and the big news here with the Slim Pro models is an upgrade to S30V steel, which offers a lot more edge retention than the 420HC that comes on the basic and classic models of the 110. The Stretch uses a drop point shape for their blade, and it's another classic hunting knife shape. But because it's Spyderco, they had to accommodate their signature opening hole, so the steel sweeps up and it doesn't look like any other drop point out there. But you can still use the hump on the spine of the blade to lift up the tip when you're getting under the skin of an animal, to avoid piercing internal organs while you're skinning. And also, I find this sort of feature useful on certain delicate EDC tasks as well. But the trade-off is it's not going to be as effective at piercing as the 110. Because that knife has a narrower tip and a swedge, which makes that point finer still. The steel on the Stretch is VG10, although if you want to spend a little bit more money, there are other options that you can upgrade to. So the edge retention is probably not going to equal the S30V on the Buck, but at the same time, it's going to be a little bit easier to sharpen when it does come time to maintain your edge. The length of the blade is a little bit shorter than on the 110 as well. We've got just about 3.5 inches on this knife. Whether you're measuring from the tip to the leading edge of the handle scale or just the sharpened edge, the Buck pulls a slight advantage here. The Stretch features a full flat grind as opposed to the hollow grind on the Buck, and you get a nice distal taper as the spine narrows out towards the tip. Spyderco also tends to keep their thicknesses right behind the sharpened edge a little bit thinner than the Buck on most of the examples that I've seen, so I'd give the nod to the Stretch in terms of cutting efficiency. That said, the more acute tip and the narrower blade of the 110 is going to help it get into tighter places than you could with the Stretch, so it'll help to weigh your needs when you're picking between the two. Now, as far as the opening action, they're both one-hand operable, but they go about it in different ways. We've got dual thumb studs on the Buck versus Spyderco's signature opening hole. Both are easy to operate, but the Spyderco takes the win for the smoothness of opening. I can get a more secure purchase on the hole, and it's further away from the pivot point than the Buck's thumb studs, generating more leverage in the process. It should be mentioned that the Spyderco's pivot screw is adjustable as well, and actually all the screws on the handle are removable, whereas all of the Buck's hardware is fixed, making tuning and cleaning a little bit easier for the Stretch user. Now, the handles between these two knives are very different. The 110 Slim Pro features a classic streamlined profile, which is much thinner than the original 110s for easy pocket carry, and you can get it in your choice of black G10, which you see here, or micarta in green or brown. Thanks to that shape that has no finger grooves or prominent swells, this is a knife that's going to work well with all different kinds of hand sizes, and when folded up, it's nice and neat when clipped into your pocket. The Stretch takes a different approach, with a wider profile to the handle and a curve to fit your hand. It does take up more room in the pocket, but you do get a fuller handhold as a result. We have a more profiled main grip section that isn't quite as long as the full grip on the Bucks. It still does fit my slightly larger hands, but if your hands are even bigger, they make up for that by integrating a full-size finger choil. This allows them to turn the dead space around the pivot into a usable space for choking up right behind the edge for fine control of the blade, as well as extending the grip for those with those larger hands. The Buck lacks that feature, but the design is still such that it's still pretty easy to choke up behind the edge, just not quite as comfortably as with the Spyderco. You also don't get the advantage of the jimping that they include on the Spyderco on both that choil and on the thumb ramp behind the opening hole. This gives you a little bit more traction when you're choking up on the blade. The material on the Stretch's handle isn't as high-end as the choices you get on the Buck. We have black FRN with Spyderco's bidirectional texturing, and it features peaks that all point towards the center logo, gives you tons of retention both forward and backward. If high amounts of traction is high up on your list of requirements from your folder, then the Stretch is the one to get. But if you prefer a smoother or more comfortable texture, the Buck is probably going to be your choice. As far as locks, both feature a lockback mechanism. The 110 Slim Pro has its release in the traditional location at the rear, while the Spyderco's is mounted amidships. Both work just fine and are perfectly ambidextrous too, which is quite nice. But the mid-mounted design on the Stretch has an advantage in being much easier to close with one hand, since the blade and the lock are much closer together. This is further reinforced by the small cutout, the boy dent on the lock bar itself, which makes it easier to locate the lock by feel alone, as well as helping to prevent accidental disengagement if you're gripping the knife hard during heavy work. Now, since the locks and the opening methods are both ambidextrous, it makes sense that the handle hardware should work well for both lefties and righties too, and that's definitely the case with both of these knives. The Buck actually features a deep carry pocket clip with a wide and stable design. You're not going to have to carry this in a belt sheath the way you would the classic 110. It's reversible for both right and left side carry, and it holds the blade in a tip-up position. And they've even included a couple of extra screws to screw down into the holes on the side of the clip you're not using to keep the profile a little cleaner looking. The Stretch goes a step further with a 4-position pocket clip. You can hold it tip up or tip down on either side of the knife. There's actually a small hole in the pocket clip as well that shows a cool piece of attention to detail with this knife. It reveals the pivot screw in the front position so you can still adjust that tension. And we've got a lanyard hole on the reverse side which runs through the clip. And that lanyard hole is something the Buck lacks if you want it. Now the clip on the Stretch is not a deep carry design, but there are plenty of aftermarket options if that's what you're after. So which one would you get? Both are great designs, and despite a similar mission profile, an EDC-friendly hunting knife each comes across with a very different personality. The Spyderco feels more precise, but the Buck brings more premium materials to the table at a better price. And it's made in the USA as opposed to Japan with the Stretch, which is going to be an important consideration to some of you out there. As mentioned, you'll spend a little bit less on the Buck right now. At this point in 2020, you'll save about $10. We're at $89.95, whereas the Stretch just crests a C note at $101.50. Be sure to let us know your choice in the comments, and in the meantime, if you want to get your hands on either of these great knives, you can click the links in the description. I'm David C. Anderson from the Knife Center, signing off. See you next time. We've got dual thumb studs on the Buck. On the Buck. I wonder if it's the batteries. Could be. It's reversible for both left and right carry, and holds the blades in a tip-up position. And it folds up nice and neatly. And it folds up